Hey there, you guys. We're back in the shop again, working on these 8.8s. This is the 8.8 that I got from Randy. This rear end came out of an 80-something Fox body. This rear end came from the 95 parts car that we have outside. Aside from the obvious difference that that one has disc brakes, this one had drum brakes, they have a couple other differences that lie below the surface. Besides the major fact that this one's 4 lug and this one's 5 lug, this one is also 1.5 inches more narrow than this one is. The wheel mounting flange to wheel mounting flange on this one, which means the surface where the wheel bolts to right here to the same surface on the other side, this one is 61 inches wide. This one here is 59.5 inches wide. However, the housing width, meaning the flange of the housing, which is here, you'll see it better once the backing plate's off. The distance here to here is the same distance as it is from there to there. So you can use the disc brake stuff on a Fox body housing. The difference comes from the axle flange here. You'll be able to see it once it's better. You'll be able to see it better once it's off. But the actual axle flange, meaning the distance from the end of the bearing there to the back here, is longer on that rear end than it is on this one. So to begin, we're going to start taking this rear end apart. This rear end is going to stay together. I'm probably going to end up hanging on to this one for my dad's car for now. That's a 355 gear. This is a 373 gear. This rear end also has a surprise in it that I was not anticipating. So to start taking it apart, you will first need to take the 10 bolts out of the diff cover, and I will set you guys up on the tripod so you can follow along with that. Okay, so we got the bolts out. Take the cover off. If your cover doesn't just come off, you do not take a screwdriver and just drive it in between the housing and the cover, because you can gouge the cover and the cover's not going to seal again. Okay, so this is the surprise that this rear end had. It has some sort of aftermarket diff in it. Normal Ford diffs don't have these little springs in here. They have a normal S spring that I'll show you inside of that housing. I'm pretty sure this is an Eaton True Track. I don't know for sure. I'll have to look it up after the fact, and I will put it on the screen right here. So first, to get these axles out, what we have to do is take this bolt out. This bolt holds this pin in, and what this pin does is it doesn't let the axles come in, because to get the axles out, you have to take that pin out, push the axle in, and there's going to be a C-clip. There's a C-clip on the end of the axle. Looks like a C. You have to push the axle in, get the clip off, because that clip holds it into the carrier right here, and this pin doesn't allow the axle to come in, obviously, unless you take it out. This is actually kind of a pain, especially if you're doing it on a 7.5, because there's no good way to get a socket in here to get this off, and most wrenches will round this off. Okay, so after a little bit of finagling, we got this bolt out. Using a drift and a hammer, usually this pin doesn't fight you too hard coming out. On a normal track lock, it will just push out. You can push it from the backside, grab it this way and pull it out. Obviously, this one's going to fight us a little bit. Make sure if you drive this pin out, you don't have it perpendicular to the housing, because you can drive this pin into the pinion gear and potentially chip your teeth off of it. So offset it a little bit. Don't hit it out too far, because then you can't rotate the carrier around to get the pin out. Now I got a screwdriver through the end of it here and wiggle it out to get the pin out. There's the pin. Don't worry, I'm going to be cleaning everything before I put it back in. Okay, so we got the first axle pushed in. As you can see right there, there's the C-clip there. All I gotta do is push it on the axle right here, and that'll expose the C-clip. I found it's easiest to use a magnet, extended magnet, to go down in here, grab the C-clip off. You can go down in here and pull the spring out like this. There she is. Do the same thing on the other side. So now after you get your C-clips out, you can pull out on your axle. It should pop out. Don't let it drag up against the seal. That's not good for it. So now the one thing that worries me with this being an aftermarket diff is that these are more than likely 31 spline axles, which is not good for us, because the axles that we have to replace these are not 31 spline axles. They're factory 28 spline axles. Okay, so this right here is where it gets a little tricky for some people. So this here is the SN95 axle. This here is the Fox body axle. It does turn out that this one is 31 spline, this one's 28, so these aren't going to directly swap unless you were to swap the carrier, which I don't want to do. I want to keep those 31 spline axles. So let's just say both of these are 28 spline axles. We're going to swap them one for another. So this axle, the SN95 axle, is obviously longer, as you can see. But the distance from here, the end of the shaft, to where the bearing sits on both of them are 27 3/4 inch. So the length that effectively is in the axle is the same. The only difference is the flange here. So I cleaned them off and laid them down a little bit. Now you can see a little bit better. This is where the end of the bearing is here, and this is where the end of the bearing is here. The shapes are just different. The stick out on this axle is longer than it is on this axle. And it just so happens to be that the stick out on this one is 3/4 inch longer than it is on this one. Total axle length on the SN95 one is 31.5 inches, whereas this one is 30 3/4, which the difference there is 3/4 inch. You take 3/4 and multiply it by 2 because both sides of the housing, that gives you another 1.5 inches. So that's why an SN95 runs wider than a Fox body. The housings are the same width, it's just the track width is wider because of the disc brake stuff. Now, if you have a Fox body rear end and you want to make it 5-lug, but you don't want to increase the track width, what you can do, and we've done it before, is take 2 Ranger axles, passenger side Ranger axles from a 2nd gen Ranger. They are the right length for a Fox body housing, and they are also made for drum brakes. Now, let's say you want to do disc brakes. So if you use 2 Ranger axles with drum brakes, that'll keep the same width overall. Wheel mounting flange to wheel mounting flange is a Fox body run, but it'll give you 5 lugs, but then you have drum brakes. So let's say you want to do Fox body width while having 5 lug and disc brakes, because it can be done. The bracket for the back of the caliper bracket that the SN95 uses can be notched, because the way that it fits originally is you take this backing plate off for the drum brakes. That comes off, and then there's another caliper bracket that goes in its place. The problem is, if you want to do discs on the back of a Fox body and keep the original width, you have to cut a notch in the bracket and put it on the back side of the housing and bolt it from the back side. So it can be done. I mean, obviously cutting away the material and losing one bolt hole isn't ideal, but in all reality, unless you're going 250 miles an hour, really doesn't make that much of a difference. So now back to my particular situation. What'll probably happen in the meantime is I'll end up just using that rear end from the SN95 parts car and just throwing it in the car for now until I can figure out something to do here. I have new pads and rotors for this rear end. All I have to do is wire wheel it, clean it up, and put it back together and put it in the car. In the meantime, what we'll end up doing is you can either have 4-lug axles re-drilled for 5-lug, and I've had that done before too, and it works fine as long as you have a machinist who knows what he's doing. They'll mount it up in a jig, use a mill, and the guy that I use has a template for the 5-lug 5x4.5 inch Ford pattern, also Mopar pattern, so that you can re-drill these for 5-lug. Now, I'm pretty sure one of the holes for the 4-lug has to be welded shut, which isn't a big deal. He's done that for me before as well. That runs about $200, whereas to get new 31 splined SN95 length axles, it's going to be probably $400 or $500 at least. Okay, so for now, we're just going to put a pin deck in this rear end, metaphorically speaking, of course. I just don't really have the money to spend $500 for a set of axles for this one when I have a good rear end that I can just clean up, put some brakes on, and just throw it in the car. So we're going to clean this one up for now. We'll keep this one on standby. Once I get the right axles for it, we're going to start working on this one again. But for now, we're just going to take this one apart, clean it up, paint it black, put all the new brake stuff on it, paint everything so it looks like new, and keep going with that. But the rest of my parts finally came. We got a new rack, a new crossmember for the T5, some sway bar end links, sway bar bushings, T5 stuff to put that T5 back together. We got a 3/4 slider assembly, billet retainer for the counter shaft so that doesn't want to walk, some new synchronizers for 5th and 4th gear since I knew that the 4th gear one was burned up a little bit. These are those hoses. I got the adapter for the brake lines. I'll show you guys more about that when I put this on. New brake lines for the back, battery cables, my Optima battery, and the retainer for that. So per NHRA rules, if you plan on running your car at the track and you put the battery in the back, you have to have a cutoff switch at the back of the car. Mandatory in the rules. It doesn't matter if you run 16 seconds or 10 seconds in the quarter mile. Batteries in the back, gotta have a battery cutoff switch, and it has to shut the car off when it's running. The problem that you'll run into if you just wire the positive through a cutoff switch is that once the car is running, if you have a charging system on it and you turn the switch off, it won't shut the car off because that alternator is charging the battery. So they have a special switch you can get that has an alternator disconnect as a part of the switch. So I got that one. I think I got that one from Summit, I want to say. I'll show you guys how to wire that up when we get to it. We're just going to take this one step at a time for now. So we got a lot of good parts. We're going to start chugging along on this car. So for this next little bit, my dad offered to give me a hand, so he's going to help me clean this rear end up. We just set it up on a time warp. Most of the stuff's pretty monotonous. All it is just cleaning up the old parts, refinishing them, and then putting them back together. I don't think I've said it yet, but this rear end that came out of that SN95 is a 355 gear, so that's a lot better than the stock 308 or 327 that this car may have had. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to clean up the axle tubes, and we're going to weld them to the differential housing. I did end up knocking out the upper control arm bushings just because they weren't in really good shape. I think they were $6 a side to get new ones, so we just went ahead and ordered some new ones. So I figured since we were this far along, I'd go ahead and weld these axle tubes up. For those of you that don't know, these axle tubes on this housing, DOM tubing, I think these are 2.5-inch tubes. They slide into the cast iron housing here, and then they're rosette welded or plug welded on both sides. Problem is, once you put a sticky tire on this and you get a couple solid dead hooks, you run the risk of breaking these plug welds off, and then this tube's going to want to turn. So since we're already this far along, before I painted it, I figured I'd just take the extra half an hour to grind these out, put a nice bead around here before I paint it and let it sit for the night. So I'll put that on time loop and let you guys watch. Okay, so what we're doing now is we're preheating the housing where the housing and the tube meet. Since this housing's cast iron, you need to get it at least somewhat preheated, or else the weld won't penetrate into the cast iron. Cast iron has a really high carbon content compared to other metals, which is why it's so hard to weld. But if you get it nearly cherry red hot, you can weld. Alright, got a nice solid bead halfway around. Now I'm going to rotate the axle housing over and do both sides again. So after letting the rear end cool down, I painted it overnight off camera. We just ended up painting it black and then painting the brakes and hardware cast iron gray like they are. Like I said before, for most street cars this really isn't necessary, but I figured since I was this far along, I had some extra time to burn anyways, so I just got the welder out and took the extra 15 minutes that it required to weld these tubes up. Okay, so putting it back together is just the opposite of taking it apart. What we'll do first, go ahead and throw these axles in. I got both axles pushed all the way in right now. I'm going to go ahead and put the C-clips back in. I usually just grab a pencil magnet, put them on the end of the magnet like that. Push them in. Once it's in, pull the axle out. Do the same thing for the other side. Okay, got both C-clips in. Got the carrier rotated over so that the hole of the pin is facing up so I can put the bolt in once we get the pin in. So we're gonna go ahead and push the pin in. Should slide in pretty easily. If it doesn't, your spider gears are probably not lined up, or you just need to clean the pin up a little bit. It's gonna be a tight fit, but it is a slip fit. It's not an interference fit, so don't pound it in. If you are confident in your abilities, at this point I would recommend putting a little bit of Loctite on the cross pin bolt, because that bolt comes out, you're not going to have a good time. Little dab will do ya. We're going to torque her down to about 5 ogadogas. Alright, it's as simple as that. My advice to you at this point is before you put the axles in, to make sure you have the backing plates on, whether it be for disc brakes or drum brakes. Unless you're putting disc brakes on a Fox body rear end and keeping the Fox length axles, this bracket will go behind the flange on the axle housing. Otherwise, you need to have these brackets on for drum brakes or disc brakes for an S95. You need to have those on before you put the axles back in. All right, there you guys. We got the rear end as done as it's going to be for now. Got the brakes on there all nice. Pretty simple to put these on. All it is, these brackets have to go on first. The bracket support brackets, whatever you'd like to call these. 2 nuts here through a U-bolt. The 2 bolts for the caliper bracket go through that and through the caliper backing plate into the bracket. Rotor goes on before you put the bracket on, the caliper bracket on. Then the caliper goes on. Got some nice new lines here, new banjo bolt. I'll probably end up making new lines to go to the center part because I don't remember exactly where it is on these, but I know for the SN95, it's a little bracket that sits right here. I want to say the Fox body splitter is right here, but I'm not positive. I got the old bushings out. I had to melt those out, unfortunately. New ones are on the way. Got the diff cover sandblasted and painted. That's pretty much the last thing that needed to be done for this before the rear end can go in. Obviously, I got these bushings in here first. Then we can put the rear end all together, get it ready to go in the car. I got a new gas tank coming, so we'll do that when the back end's up in the air. Got sway bar bracket painted, bolts polished up real nice. New bushings, end links. This is the diff cover. Did it in the hammer tone. So that's pretty much as far as we're gonna get with the rear end for now. So what we're gonna move on to next is the engine. All right, guys, it's next day. Most of my engine parts came, so we're gonna start tearing into this small block Ford. This is the motor that originally came out of the 82 GT. Just for a quick refresher, we are going to use this motor for now. I got a cam for it. We're going to put all new gaskets in it. Not sure if we're going to do head gaskets or not yet. We'll see if they end up needing it. So, before I start taking this apart, I'm going to wire wheel a lot of this grease off just because it's a lot easier to contain where everything's going with it still together and then fine cleaning everything once it's apart. So we're going to put it on a time loop and start wire wheeling this whole girl down. Okay, so we got the motor wire wheeled down. It was actually pretty clean. This side was already pretty well degreased. There wasn't really a whole lot of grease on the side. This side was the bad side. So as you can see, we got the pan off. Let me just start off by saying I am not overly fond of using cork gaskets. They dry up really fast. They don't seal the greatest to begin with. And once they dry up, they get really brittle and just start to deteriorate. So, like, as you can see right here, part of this pan gasket was cork. This so the gasket sealed right here, obviously, and this is like the overhang from it, the lip, if you will, that big piece of chunk. Same deal over here, and you might be asking yourself, why isn't it like that all the way why isn't it like that all the way around the block? That's because it already fell off, and it looks like the oil pump pickup picked up most of it, unfortunately. I pried this up already, but the only bit that was showing of the screen still was this little bit right here. I could see all the way around it. Everywhere else was plugged up, and it started to suck this tin in, which is not good. That indicates oil starvation. Looking in the pan, didn't look terrible. I mean, it's obviously really dirty. I had 120,000 miles on it, but it did have some metallic stuff in it. Can't really see it very well now. You can see a little bit there. I was hoping the bearings would be in good shape. I'm still hoping they are. So we'll take a couple of bearing caps off and we'll see what it looks like. I pulled the bearing cap off of cylinder 5. The rod bearing actually looks really nice. Nice even wear, not too bad. The main bearing also wore evenly, but she's pretty well cooked, it looks like. It looks like it's got a little bit of heat in it. If you can see that, the discoloration through the middle of the bearing right there. This bearing's obviously wiped, but it's evenly wiped, if that makes any sense. The crank looks pretty solid, actually, surprisingly. The rod, or the journal for the rod, about the same. So it looks like the play is going to be to take it all the way apart and put some bearings in it, bare minimum, if I want it to last even remotely long. Re-ring kit's only, I want to say it's under $300 for one of these motors. It would probably be worth doing just so it runs reliably and I don't have to worry about it. So not exactly what I was hoping to find, but not the worst thing that I could have found either. It could have already spun a rod bearing and that would have stopped me dead in my tracks. So I suppose I'll have to get a re-ring kit ordered and we'll take it the rest of the way apart. Okay guys, so we got the motor flipped back over. I took the heads off and found some less than fortunate news. Not really what I was hoping to see. We got cylinder 7 and 8 here. They both got water in them at some point. And then cylinder 3 as well. They were both pretty bad. I put the crank bolt back in with the breaker bar trying to get it to spin over. It won't go over now. I did turn it over with the starter when I had the motor in the car. Obviously it had mechanical advantage then, and I don't have as much mechanical advantage now. So the long and short of it is this motor's junk. It's gonna have to be rebuilt at minimum. I was hoping to just put some bearings and some gaskets in this thing and run it. But at this point, it does not look like that's gonna happen. So we have a special guest here, Hannah Montana.
That's me.
What do you think about these recent advancements in the news with the build? What do you think?
I don't know, man. I don't know. This is bad news. Bad news. This is probably the worst news I've heard all day.
Well, you heard it straight from the horse's mouth. We got some bad news. So what's probably going to end up happening now, we're going to take the motor that's sitting under the pallet rack in there, the motor that came from my dad's car, which is also from an 82 GT. We'll slap some bearings and rings in that, and then we'll just end up running that for now. So, like I said, less than ideal, but that's probably where we're going to be this video ends, you guys. Y'all take care now.